Power structures continued to change in the 1980s and 1990s. President Ronald Reagan's appeal to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev came 2 years before the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. 2 years after the fall, a coup ousted Gorbachev from power. The Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War was over. The US-Soviet Union rivalry that had dominated the world stage for nearly 5 decades ended. Governments in only a few countries, such as China, North Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam, still called themselves communist. Political alliances changed and economic interactions among nations expanded. Despite the persistent mistrust between the two countries, diplomatic relations between the United States and the Soviet Union were maintained, albeit inconsistently at times. During the last decades of the conflict, proxy wars in support of opposing sides in international conflicts remained standard for both nations. These conflicts reinforced the fundamental disagreement between the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. Agreements between the superpowers to limit nuclear weapons played a key role in ending the Cold War. However, the path to a thaw was not always steady. After resolving the crises of the 1960s, which included the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, the relationship between the superpowers improved in the following decade. This period of time was called détente, a relaxation of strained relations between nations. One symbol of détente was the visit of President Richard Nixon to the Soviet Union in 1972. Nixon and Soviet leader Brezhnev signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT, designed to freeze the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles that each power could keep. To play one power against the other, Nixon also visited China that year. It was the first visit by an American president in the existence of communist China. Détente served both the US and the Soviet needs at the time. The Soviet Union faced challenges during the late 1960s and the 1970s. Economically, the USSR was in a crisis. It was no longer growing. Central government controls prevented farmers and manufacturers from deciding what to grow or make and what to charge for it. Foreign trade was extremely limited. Eastern European Soviet bloc countries were bucking for reforms and freedom from Moscow's direct control. The Soviet military violently put down the Prague Spring, a liberation movement in Czechoslovakia. Russia also faced skirmishes with China along their shared border, a reflection of the troubled relationship between the two communist countries. The United States also faced difficulties. President Nixon was mired in the Vietnam War, a costly and unpopular conflict. The American economy was suffering as well. The possibility of establishing relations with China would, Nixon knew, open potential new markets to the United States and at the same time press a bit on the strained Soviet-Chinese relationship. Détente could help the United States maintain its containment policy and might ease tensions between the superpowers. As a result of détente, the United States started to sell excess stores of American grain to the Soviet Union, where drought had created a shortage. This benefited American farmers, who now had access to new large market for goods, and the struggling people of the Soviet Union. However, after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, U.S. President Jimmy Carter halted the grain shipments. This action marked the end of détente. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan to prop up that country's communist government against Muslim fighters. Estimates of Afghan civilian deaths vary from 500,000 to 2 million. Millions of Afghans fled to Pakistan and Iran, and many within the country became homeless. Ultimately, the Soviet army could not conquer the guerrilla groups in the rough terrain of Afghanistan. Soviet legitimacy was undermined and new forms of political participation in Afghanistan developed. While the collapse of the Soviet Union would not occur until 12 years after the Afghan War began, the war put immense stress on the Soviet Union's centralized economic system and left Soviet leadership vulnerable to reform. During the presidency of Ronald Reagan, tensions between the Americans and the Soviets increased even further. Reagan referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire and sent military aid, including weapons, to support the Afghans. The Soviet Union resented this overtly militaristic move. In addition, by early 1980s, the United States and the Soviet Union had more than 12,000 nuclear missiles, each one pointed at the other side. Not only would the superpowers destroy each other with a nuclear exchange, but the rest of the world would also be destroyed 7 times over. In light of this growing tension, Reagan declared that the United States would create a missile defense program he called the Strategic Defense Initiative. Dubbed Star Wars after the internationally popular 1977 film by critics, the system would supposedly destroy any Soviet nuclear missiles that targeted the United States or its allies. Lacking such a system, the Soviets would be unable to keep U.S. missiles from hitting targets in the Soviet Union. The Soviets saw this move as the beginning of an arms race in space. While it was not an immediate threat that required a quick response, it worried liberal and moderate Soviets who wanted reforms. They saw it as a long-term economic concern and one that strengthened the hand of Soviet conservatives. The Soviets objected loudly to Reagan's plan, but it was just a plan. It never happened. The increase in tensions during the 1980s led to other nations believing that they must choose sides between the superpowers. Non-aligned nations hoped that they would not experience a nuclear holocaust. In this tense atmosphere, Mikhail Gorbachev, a more progressive communist than previous Soviet leaders, came to power in 1985. He favored attempts to restructure the Soviet economy to allow elements of free enterprise and glasnost, or the policy of opening up Soviet society and the political process by granting greater freedom. Reagan and Gorbachev met 3 times in 2 years. The two men liked each other and, despite tough negotiations, created a working relationship that ultimately delivered results. In 1987, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed on a new nuclear arms treaty. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF, restricted nuclear weapons. Around the world, people could breathe a cautious sigh of relief as the world's 2 superpowers reduced the risk of nuclear war. The INF and other U.S.-Soviet agreements quieted some of the more bellicose Cold War supporters in both countries. With less pressure from Soviet conservatives, Gorbachev could more easily implement political and economic reforms in the Soviet Union. One aspect of Gorbachev's reform program was an end to economic support for the Soviet satellites in Eastern Europe. He also implied that the Soviet army would no longer come to the rescue of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. In effect, economic reform in the Soviet Union provided greater freedom to the other communist countries. Once people in those countries got a small taste of freedom, they wanted more. As a result, democratic reform movements swept through Eastern European nations in 1989. The Berlin Wall was torn down. In October 1990, East and West Germany reunited as one country. With most of Eastern European nations caught up in democratic reforms, it was not long before the Soviet Union was also swept into that movement. Lithuania, Georgia, and other Soviet republics began to overthrow their rulers and declare independence. The Warsaw Pact dissolved. Gorbachev's reforms ultimately led to his political downfall and the end of the Soviet Union in December 1991. Among the former Soviet republics that became independent countries, Russia emerged as the strongest. The Cold War had ended. The decline of a superpower presented opportunities and several challenges. Political alliances changed and economic interactions among nations expanded. With this new openness, particularly with regard to trade, the world became more interconnected than ever before. This interconnectedness produced greater wealth for some, but hardship for others. The post-Cold War world had to grapple with new democracies, vast economic inequality, ethnic conflict and genocide, terrorism, environmental degradation, and global epidemics.